right, sounds good. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, everyone. So glad to be here. When you think about making maps, you usually think about roads and streets and buildings and things like that, getting from point A to point B. But today I want to show you a new kind of map. And this is a map of people. This is a map of my hometown of Baltimore, but it's a map of all the Twitter users in Baltimore.
Leave it here.
And I should warn you first that this is not a geographic map in any way. This is a map of communities. So what you see here is that each of these groups of color, and if you can see my laser pointer here, all these folks in green have more friends in common with each other than they do with anybody else.
So basically in 30
And likewise, the folks on this end of the map in pink have more friends in common with each other than they do with anybody else on the network. This group here is basically people that are interested in like sports, and they're kind of connecting these two ends of the network. Now, if you're familiar with some of the things that have been happening in some of the US cities over the last couple of years, you know that there's been some civil unrest. And what's happening is that these communities, these groups of people, and these groups of people are really clashing because they're not well connected with each other. And you know, if you actually look at these people and look at kind of who they are and what they're interested in, what you find is that these are young, African-American, you know, black males for the most part, and that these people over here are primarily, you know, sort of middle-class white folks. And there's really very little connection between them. Now, I'm kind of a geek, kind of an entrepreneur, kind of a, you know, startup kind of person, and they're kind of on this end of the network, very far removed from the folks on this end of the network. And if you actually look at the people at each end, they're almost opposites of each other. So let's look at some other examples. This is St. Louis, Missouri, another city that's quite like Baltimore. And you can see that there's the same kind of segregation pattern that you see here. This is kind of middle-class, white, entrepreneurial kind of people here, and like arts and culture and things here. And then over here on this end, younger, African-American, primarily males. And then up here, you've got a bunch of white young people. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting about this is that I made this map about a year ago. And I predicted at that time that if we saw a similar kind of catalyzing incident in Baltimore that had happened already in St. Louis, that we could expect to see the same kind of violence. And in fact, in April of 2015, we saw that prophecy, sadly, actually come true. And one of the things that you can do with these maps is look at them in a couple of different ways. Next slide, there we go. This actually is looking at the actual pictures, the avatars of these individual accounts. So you can actually verify kind of the racial and, you know, socioeconomic identity of these people and try to understand what's going on here. And one of the things that you see here is that in the center of the map, you see there's kind of a hole. And that's really a place where there's disconnection. There's nobody connecting these two sections of the network. And that, at the heart, is really the issue that you can start to understand with this kind of mapping. Next slide, there we go. So this is, you know, what we ended up witnessing in Baltimore in April, and, you know, just as a result of these tensions between these groups. Now let's take a look at a few other examples. This is Istanbul, and there's several interesting things here, one of which is this group here, young men, mostly frustrated young men who really, really want girls to like them, and they write poetry to prove it. And I didn't come up with that sort of categorization on my own. I, you know, worked with some folks in Istanbul to try to understand the traffic coming out of this network. But I should point out that this community of people is, you know, it's not a question of what they're saying, it's a question of how they're connected. I'm mapping the network structure, not so much worried about the actual words coming out. The words we figure out once we know what the structure is, right? So they're on one end of the spectrum, and, you know, they're young men who are trying to kind of make their way in the world and figure out how they want to proceed. And the real question, I think, for the Middle East is, like, what happens to this cohort of young men? How do they become integrated in with the economy and with society and, you know, move forward? Up on this end, this is kind of the technology, geeky, entrepreneur sort of folks up here. And they're kind of at the opposite ends of these, you know, the network with each other. And in sports, again, football and Turkey acts as a connector. And then you have kind of the conservative religious ruling party type stuff over here. And then some younger adults, they're sort of like these folks in their next phase, it looks like, talking about different aspects of life. Now, there's another thing that happens when you censor the internet. which is that you end up popping up things that sort of would be on the normal internet in parts of like Twitter. So sexuality, specifically a lot of gay sexuality ends up turning up there, which is interesting. This also is a group of trolls that appear to be trying to sway mostly folks in these two cohorts, try to sway them towards their political point of view. So it's an interesting way of kind of understanding how this network is constructed and seeing that there are people that are trying to influence opinion, things like that. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. So Barcelona is actually a little bit more balanced. And I'm just showing you some different examples so you can get a feel for kind of how places vary. But one of the main things you see here is this Catalonian independence. Obviously, in the last few months, they've just voted to go ahead with that. And then entrepreneurs over here. One thing we find pretty consistently is that entrepreneurs are sort of at odds with a lot of other communities. There's not always a connection between the entrepreneurial community and like political communities and or youth and things like that. But otherwise, you've got arts and culture over here. You've got FC Barcelona up here, which is obviously a big deal. And then various kinds of literature and writing over here. And then in the middle, mainstream TV and radio. One of the interesting things about Barcelona is that you don't see some kind of like really large disaffected group of people that are like off by themselves, feeling very cut off from society. It seems to be relatively more balanced than a lot of other places. Next slide, please. This is Saudi Arabia, and just a few interesting things here. One of the interesting things is that on the far end here, it runs from kind of a very conservative religious kind of point of view to a more liberal point of view on this end. And you've even got like teenage girls pretty clearly visible down here. And they're kind of off by themselves. And I think that's because, in that culture, they're probably not really supposed to be talking to anybody but themselves, and maybe shouldn't even be online, and that sort of thing. Sexuality again pops up here as a little node that becomes quite visible when you censor the internet. Prayers and advice from the Quran over here. Football, two separate groups here supporting halal, and then another group supporting the other team, Nasser. And then various kinds of conservative social commentary up here, as well as marketer poets. These are folks that I call marketer poets because they are trying to monetize the Quran with like daily inspirational quotes, which is interesting. Next slide, please. San Francisco. You hear a lot about San Francisco being the hub of startup culture and all of that. But one of the interesting things that people don't really talk about there is that the influx of geeks and like new VC money have actually created kind of a separate cohort of people that are not all that well integrated in with the rest of the city. So here you have kind of all the things you might expect to see in a map of San Francisco culture, media and politics and food and arts and music and things like that. But they're kind of off by themselves. And in fact, even this group here is so clearly obvious to be Twitter employees that they're kind of off by themselves. The former CEO of Twitter is right about here. And what you find, next slide, please. Next slide. What you find is that manifests itself in the real world in a pretty real way. So this is a sign that somebody spotted in the Mission District in San Francisco, basically, saying that they were tired of having all these venture capital driven, people showing up in their neighborhood and driving up the rents and, starting all these fancy restaurants and making everything too expensive. And you even see things like this, evict Twitter over here, where there's a feeling that they're kind of changing the neighborhood that they're located in. Next slide, please. So a few weeks ago, I was in the United Arab Emirates, and I thought you guys might like to see kind of what that looks like. One of the key things that you see here is that the ruling families and sort of government ministers are really quite central. And the various sheiks and whatnot there have gone out of their way to really try to get connected into this youth population. And I think that's quite intentional. They're trying to portray an image of kind of success and, try to create an appealing image that these young folks would want to kind of be involved with. So they seem to be doing a pretty good job of that. And then on this end, you have kind of this international group of sort of expats and the people that you sort of think are doing business in Dubai, and they're really quite separate from this sort of younger group, mostly Arabic speaking, This group over here, mostly English speaking. And then in the middle, you kind of have some media and telephone companies, and then some youth-oriented things, football over here, and then government ministries and sort of government services down here. So it again shows that there's kind of a distillation of like different interests into different ends of the network map. Next slide, please. So this is Lebanon, you guys. A few interesting things to note here. One of which is that pop culture is a very prominently displayed thing here, sort of television and radio and popular singers, things like that, up on this end of the map. And then over here, you have kind of politics and the prime minister and things like that, and various movements. I noticed this future movement and the free patriotic movement, not necessarily aligned, but they're there together. And then 64% of these tweets here, or these users, are in the Arabic language. As we're down here, this is where you guys, most of you, I think, probably are. This conference is right about here, sort of the bottom edge of this blue part here. And this is sort of like travel, tourism, entrepreneurship, business, very international in focus, and 74% of this in English language. So a really reversal from almost every other part of the map. Where on this part, where this is an emerging, sort of a fast-growing community of students, Christians, young people, bloggers, 65% in the Arabic language. So these are my initial findings on Lebanon. I don't claim that they're, obviously we could refine this further, but what I find is that even as we do refine it, the overall structure doesn't change much. This is pretty much the structure of things in Lebanon. So there's two interesting things to kind of note here. One is that it is a little bit eccentric. There is, I think, a divide between these two communities, and I think that's pretty really, and easy to see here. But I also would say that there isn't some other, third group that's off by themselves on social media, separate from these groups here. I think this accurately represents the groups that are operating in the context of Lebanon. So next slide, please. Now, just to give a little bit of sense of kind of the timing of things, this is just a really rough snapshot, but the thing I wanted to show you here was that the early days of Twitter, like 2007, 2008, mid-2009, were really pretty flat, but then all of these groups started to take off around June 2009. Then it kind of dropped back down again in terms of new user growth, and then spiked again in the spring of 2011. I think we all know why. And then, grew again between then and December 2012, and then it started to kind of drop a little bit, and then grow again, specifically with this green line here, and that's that younger Christian kind of student kind of group. Seems to be the up-and-coming new community on Twitter. So, a couple of other interesting things to note with these different networks. This media and entertainment group, primarily mobile, 70% mobile. The average account age is 3.1 years. So this is, statistically speaking, the newest community on this group, but it's also got some of the largest follower numbers. So the size of these dots indicate the number of inbound followers from this data set here. And then this group over here, 50% mobile, account age 4.1 years, so a little bit older, and 31% iOS, 18% Android, 12% web. And then over here, this student kind of Christian group, which is growing a lot right now. Average account age 4.1 years, 51% mobile, 31% iOS, 18% Android, 12% web. And then this group here is the oldest group, and I think probably represents a lot of you in this community here. They've been on an average of 5 years, 25% iOS, 12% Android, 9% web, and really are kind of the first group that was on the map, and then everything else kind of grew up around that. This is taking just kind of another slice. This is saying, show me everybody with greater than 200 followers, and I know that you can't read those names specifically. But, again, these are a lot of kind of entertainment and news-related things up here, singers and things like that at the top in red, and then, these other communities. And one of the things you note is that this community here doesn't really have very many people greater than 200 followers. So they're much more like individual users. They're not really brands. They're not trying to market. This group is all about marketing up here, and this lower group down here is also somewhat oriented around that. And then government services And politics, those also have some reasonable follower counts. Okay, so just to give you a couple of other ideas on things you can do with this kind of stuff. One of the things that you can do is map out other types of networks, like AngelList, which if you don't know it is, you should definitely check it out if any of you are aspiring entrepreneurs and want to raise funding and things like that. It's a wonderful way to get in touch with investors all around the world. And one of the things you can do with this is actually map out different regions. So like this is basically sort of the Russian sphere of influence up here. This is Israeli over here, and different subnetworks. I believe this one's Turkish over here. No, this one's Turkish, and this one I believe is in the Arab world. So there's a lot of very clear patterns that become very obvious when you start to visualize data in this way. This is another type of thing you can do with AngelList data, looking at like individual sectors. So one of the things that we wanted to try to figure out, I have a product called Maelstrom that is in the email space, and we wanted to try to understand who all of our competitors were. So we made a map showing all the different competitors that we had and try to understand all the relationships with investors that they had so that we would maybe pick different or some of the same investors, but understand our place in this larger context. And then this is a map that I made of all the angel investors in the US. And if you actually zoom in on this, what you'll see is that this group down here in the lower right represents folks from like New York. This is Boston over here, San Francisco up here, and then a lot of folks who kind of play in all the different regions in the center. And you can see that all very clearly defined. And of course, Dave McClure, whose name you've heard a couple of times, is right there in the center in yellow, just off to the left. He's kind of the 900-pound gorilla in terms of being connected to everybody everywhere. So you get a sense of kind of how the world works by looking at these visualizations. So you might ask, well, Twitter is interesting, AngelList is interesting. What about other things like Facebook? Well, up till a few months ago, you could do things like visualize your own Facebook network. That's now impossible because of new API restrictions. I think we need to give real thought as to kind of how we want to be able to get access to this kind of data, because right now we're at the mercy of these companies, and even the Twitter data that I've gathered here, and the AngelList data, I had to go to a lot of trouble to get that data. It's not easy to do, and we need to think about how we want to be able to access this kind of data going forward. Same thing with LinkedIn. Next slide. Yeah. So this is an interesting visualization that I made that I normally show with kind of a two-stage display, but putting this not sign over it afterwards. But what this is showing is data from LinkedIn showing all the different employers in my town of Baltimore and showing how they're all related to each other in terms of employees that they've shared. This is a wonderful way to understand how my city works, and I can't do it anymore because as of May 2015, LinkedIn shut off access to some of these things. So this gets us to a bigger question. All of these sort of social media related movements that we've seen take root around the world, certainly in this part of the world, but also in Hong Kong and in the United States and other places, have been driven by this idea that social media is kind of a black box. And that if we just get enough people and we tweet hard enough, that it'll just make it to everybody and everybody will find out and they'll get involved. And the fact of the matter is that that's just really not true. It's really, really difficult for you to get a message from your, little corner of the network, and we find that most of us inhabit these very, certain corners. It's very difficult for you to get your point of view out to this broader network, and furthermore, unless you know what the scope of that network is, like the reaches of the universe actually are, you're not even going to know how to craft your message to have it reach these, further boundaries of these networks that you're trying to get activated. So that's a real problem, and I think it actually gets down to kind of fundamental rights around free speech and our ability to organize and things like that, and it's something we're going to have to grapple with over the next several years. So I would encourage you to think about, again, how do we want to live in the world with this kind of data, and how are we going to use it in a way that enables us and doesn't lead to tyranny? If you think about this kind of situation in Turkey, where Erdogan has repeatedly used various techniques to try to shut down and slow the flow of various kinds of information. Twitter is one way. There's other ways too. That's a real opportunity for tyranny. I really hesitate to think about the kind of world that we will live in where governments like this have access to detailed structural information about our society and people do not. You guys should all have the right to have access to that kind of information if you want to be able to control and self-govern and have self-determination. So I think that's a really, really interesting emerging problem, and it's one that hasn't really been considered that deeply yet. Next slide. So lastly, I would probably leave you with the thought that as entrepreneurs and as business people, I wouldn't overestimate the reach of social media. It is an incredibly powerful tool, but at the end of the day, you really need to understand the structure of it. You need to understand its limitations, and think realistically about how you're going to use social media to reach your target customers. The other thing I would say is that based on this kind of analysis, it's pretty clear that the market reach and market size for social media inside of a country like Lebanon is relatively limited. Just to give you some statistics to go with the maps that I showed you on Lebanon, I was showing there about 8,000 to 10,000 different users, nodes, that are verifiably in this geography that we can visualize into communities. There are probably about 40 to 50,000 that I was able to identify total, but most of those hardly have any followers, and where they do have followers, they're outside of the region. So, it's a pretty small community, and the problem with social media and our perceptions of it is that it kind of tricks us into thinking that it's a big deal because we're inside of it and we're looking around us, and what we see is all the stuff that we know, but it's only really relevant to you, and you kind of need to get rid of that bias that you have that it's so huge and massive, and really think about the broader global scale, how different markets interconnect, and what you're really trying to achieve, because it can be a real distraction, I think, to overestimate the importance of it on the local scale. So happy to talk with any of you about these concepts. I'm going to be doing a lot more work on this over the next couple of years. I've been working on it for the last year or so. I think it's a really interesting emerging set of tools that we're going to be able to have access to, but we also need to be, I think, very mindful about the kind of future that we'd like to create. So thanks very much.